Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shani Bartlett. I'm from the University of Pretoria, and I hope you all enjoy this presentation on the history of sex and gender in competitive sports. This quote from 1912 by the founder of the modern Olympic Games, as he's most commonly known, is one of my favorite quotes to start off with in any kind of discussion about sex and gender in sport. Not because what it says is necessarily correct or because I agree with it, but because what is said in the single quote and the underlying tone of it finds a lot of relevance and application in modern sports as we know it today. And the quote goes that women in sport are all against the law of nature. And the underlying message in it is that somehow a woman competing in sport is an anomaly, that we don't really belong there because we are somehow inferior to men. And that is a message that has seemed to carry through to modern sport as we know it today. And we're going to get into that a little bit later on in this presentation as well. We're going to start off by taking a look at gender verification testing and the history of the practice in competitive sports. And to understand the underlying reasoning behind gender verification testing, you have to go back quite a while in terms of the history of competitive sports. The history of gender discrimination in competitive sports can actually be traced back all the way to the ancient Olympic Games, where women weren't even allowed to attend the games, never mind trying to compete. This was due to the belief that women need to be protected from sports due to the possible damage that it could have on their femininity and fertility. And this is actually a belief that has carried on into more modern ideas of women in sport. So the original gender verification testing um, actually was a practice that was implemented in the ancient Olympic Games. And the story goes that a woman from a prominent household wanted to watch her son compete in the Olympics. And to do this, she had to disguise herself as a male trainer. During the course of the event, she was found out, and since that day, all male trainers had to attend the event in the nude. So the original gender verification testing is clearly based on the idea or the fear that women would want to masquerade as men. However, modern gender verification testing is actually founded on the idea of the opposite, or the fear of the opposite. It's founded on the fear that men would want to masquerade as women in order to compete in women's events. So as I just explained, modern gender verification testing is founded in the need to root out gender fraud. Now, the 1930s saw a rise in ad hoc testing such as nude parades, certificates of femininity, and examination of secondary sex characteristics. However, it wasn't until 1936 that the first official gender verification policy was suggested, and it was suggested by an American named Avery Brundage. And his proposal was sparked by two instances where athletes had once competed as women before transitioning into male. And somehow he believed that because they had transitioned to male athletes or to the male sex, that they had always had this advantage over women, the male advantage that a lot of people believe men have over women in sports. So of course we know that this is not true. But nevertheless, the 1936 Olympics then added a lot of fuel to the fire with two instances of alleged gender fraud. The first is Heinrich Ratchin, and the second is the case of Helen Stevens. So, Ratchin's case is actually a very interesting case because it is the only case of legitimate gender fraud that we can find in the history of the modern Olympic Games. So he competed in the 1936 Olympics as Dora in the women's high jump event, and he actually placed fourth. But what's more interesting about his case is that none of the ad hoc testing at that stage had caught him out. In fact, his story was revealed to the world through an interview that he did with the media, wherein he explained that um, what he had done was for the honor and benefit of Germany. Now, Helen Stevens is also a very interesting case. She was accused by a Polish runner, Stella Walsh, of gender fraud, and she was subsequently subjected to visual inspection, and she passed that, after which her name was cleared. But the story doesn't really end there. In a very surprising twist of fate, Stella Walsh was actually killed in a bank robbery, and her autopsy revealed that genetically she was actually male, with the majority of her cells containing an XY chromosome pattern. After the 1936 Olympics, in 1946, the IAAF actually implemented the first formal policy for female sex determination. And what's interesting to note is that 2 years later, the IOC followed. And this is a trend that you see quite often with the IAAF and the IOC. The IAAF will do something, and then 2 years later, the IOC might follow. So the initial testing that was implemented were very similar to the ad hoc testing. It was practices like nude parades, which actually mean exactly what they say. Essentially, the female athletes were lined up in a row and they had to stand in the nude for the male doctors, to inspect them to certify that they are in fact female. Other practices were genital exams, which again say exactly what they are, and certificates of femininity. And the certificates of femininity are actually very interesting because it's essentially just a doctor's note that says that you are female. And it's a practice that has actually carried on to a lot of sports today. A lot of combat sports and contact sports as well um, use a policy of these certificates for their gender verification testing. And after the initial implementation, the test like the nude parade failed to discover any masquerading men. So what happened next was that the IOC and the IAAF implemented what they thought at the time was a much more scientific method of determining your gender and sex, which is the Barr body test. Now, the Barr body is an inactive second X chromosome, which is found in women with a typical XX genotype. The Barr body test works by detecting the second X chromosome, which doesn't appear in a typical XY male. However, the test caused a lot of problems for intersex athletes, and it also failed to catch any masquerading men. So the IOC then decided to replace it with a test for the SRY gene. And the SRY gene was actually just discovered a few years before this test. And it leads, to the development of the testes. And the IOC believed that this is what gave men their athletic advantage. However, it was later abandoned due to the lack of evidence supporting the idea that the gene was linked in any way to competitive advantage. And it also, again, caused a lot of problems for intersex athletes as well as transgender athletes. Then, after a round of false positives in the 1996 Olympics, the IOC followed the IAAF in abandoning systematic gender verification testing in favor of suspicion-based testing. Skip forward a couple of years, and women have been competing in the Olympics for a little over 100 years. And we've been doing that largely based on a binary system of classification in sporting events, one for men and one for women. And gender verification testing, as we've seen, was specifically developed to ensure that those competing in the category female were in fact female and not male. However, what does it mean to be female? And it's interesting to note that a lot of authors actually believe that the biggest problem facing the binary system of sex and gender classification itself is the binary system itself. And after examining the history of gender verification testing, it becomes clear that there are a lot of problems facing organizations trying to classify people into a binary system. And we're going to look at those problems now. There are two problems with the binary system of classification. The first is that it fails to take into consideration that culture shapes and creates the human body in as much as genetics do. Bodies are the products of specific historical and cultural practices and are therefore not shaped by genetics alone, but by power relations and cultural views of what is and is not desirable. And sport has historically reaffirmed these views and preferences through the binary system, which is based on the assumption that naturally women should not be able to compete at the same level as men. And as elite sport became more modernized in the late 19th century, many speculated on issues of physical display and its effect on modesty, masculinity, and the supposed risk of sterility. And these are similar fears to what the ancient Greeks had in the ancient Olympic Games. Now, the other problem with the binary system is that it is based on the idea that you are either male or female, and that this division is a very clearly marked line. Once you cross the line, you are no longer in the one half, but in the other. However, this division is not as clear as we believe. The division is based on something that we all believe to be the basis of sex and gender, your genetics. You're either XX, which means you're female, or XY, which means you're male. But many people actually fall outside of these two categories, and therefore there is no either or, but shades of difference. The human body is too complex for either ors, and that is the main problem with the binary system. It attempts to place people into boxes that don't actually exist in nature, but only through social constructs. In the current climate, the IOC now encourages federations to follow a hormone-based approach to defining eligibility to compete in female sports. The IAAF's regulation is one such approach. However, as with previous gender verification testing and the binary system itself, it excludes both intersex athletes and transgender female athletes, and it further is only imposed on female athletes. So in what follows, I'll take a quick look at the IAAF's actual regulations and give a few critiques that a lot of people have on them, myself included, but not all of the critiques. So the first problem is that the regulations are only imposed on female athletes. And it's interesting to note that the IAAF's rationale behind the regulations themselves is that high levels of testosterone are the deciding factor in athletics performance across the board. But when asked why only female athletes are tested and not male athletes, as hyperandrogenism is actually a condition that occurs in both male and female athletes, the IAAF said that there is no scientific evidence to support the idea that high levels of testosterone in male athletes lead to a competitive advantage. However, they maintained, and they still maintain, that it does lead to a competitive advantage for female athletes, and there is apparently scientific evidence, according to them, that say that this is true. However, the question of why female athletes are only tested becomes a lot more interesting when you take a look at some statistics. So one study actually took a look at how many female athletes and male athletes test outside of the normal range prescribed by the IAAF's older regulations. And it found that 8% of female athletes actually tested above the normal range, which seems like a lot, but not as much as the 25% of male athletes which tested below the normal range of what is considered to be the male range of testosterone. What's even more interesting is that one study actually predicted that by the year 2064, female athletes will have bridged the performance gap and will be running at the same times as their male counterparts in athletics events. Historically, gender verification has always been imposed on female athletes, and it might be quite indicative of a belief that it is less likely that a female athlete might want to compete against male athletes. And this is very similar to the policies regulating transgender athletes, which don't seem to look at a female athlete that might want to compete against male athletes in the future. One of the biggest reasons that the IAAF has for their regulations is that to allow hyperandrogynous athletes to compete in female events would be a danger to the level playing field and fair play. In what follows, I'll examine this specific rationale. So let's take a quick look at the level playing field argument. To understand this argument properly, you need to realize that there's a difference between fair play and a level playing field. So fair play essentially is the ethics of playing fair. So what we mean by this is that your athlete, for example, follows the rules and doesn't cheat and they don't dope, amongst a few other things. But when we talk about the level playing field, what we are really talking about is an equal field of play. It's the idea that all athletes have an equal opportunity and potential to achieve success, and that they are all equally likely to do so. But by definition, sport has no level playing field. Each athlete is unique and has their own advantage over another. That's why we find sports so exciting to watch, because we never really know what the outcome will be. There are countless naturally occurring physical traits which athletes are never tested for or regulated, despite clear advantages that they provide these athletes. In fact, by the nature of the elite athlete population, they have an increased probability that advantages like these are present in some form or another. Sporting federations further don't actually make an effort to level the playing field based on non-biological factors, which also contribute to athletic advantages. For example, the IOC doesn't separate events based on the size of countries' populations or financial resources and training conditions for athletes. None of these are taken into account when we discuss the level playing field. For some reason, lately, the only thing we actually talk about when we are discussing the level playing field is hyperandrogynous athletes. Now, the idea that fairness and a level playing field requires a strict separation of men and women in sport is actually over-inclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. It is over-inclusive because it is applied even when strict separation does not lead to fairness. But it is under-inclusive because it ignores other factors which are more likely to cause an uneven playing field, if such a playing field could exist. Again, here in our current example of hyperandrogenism and the IAAF regulations, we see that maleness is seen as a proxy for a competitive advantage. However, sorting athletes by sex does not actually necessarily sort them by physical characteristics that are relevant to their sporting code. And that's the main problem with not only the binary system and the belief of a level playing field, but with the IAAF's regulations in general. The last point that the IAAF tries to make when discussing their level playing field argument is that it is there to protect the very essence of Olympism. Now, there's a very long definition of Olympism in the WADA code, but essentially it can be summed up in the last two lines of it. It is the pursuit of human excellency through the development and perfection of natural abilities. And I want you to read that again, slowly, because it's very important for the current argument against these regulations. The pursuit of human excellency through the development and perfection of natural abilities. These regulations try to regulate a natural phenomenon. Fairness in respect of the spirit of the sport does not require a limitation on natural physical advantages. Logically, asking an athlete to limit these natural talents actually destroys the very ideology that these regulations are trying to protect. Hyperandrogenism is a natural phenomenon. It is no different from any other exceptional biological variation in athletes, and it should not be treated any differently, especially not if your argument is that you're trying to protect the spirit of the sport and the level playing field. To end off with, I'd like to leave you all with this quote from Justice O'Regan and a few closing thoughts to think about. The test of a society's commitment to common humanity is in how well we protect the marginalized, dispossessed, and outcast of our society. What does it say about our society when we choose to exclude the exceptional from participating in an event that was founded on allowing participation of the exceptional only because they are different from the normal? What does it tell us about our humanity that we would rather subject these athletes to cruel and humiliating testing and ask them to change who they naturally are just so that the majority of us can feel more at ease? Thank you very much.